let's go ahead and jump in. Well, again, thanks for being with us for Quali Days 2021. Today, this particular session is, I'm going to go ahead and show you quite a bit around how you can take Quali Build to do something specifically around COVID as advanced as contract tracing on your campus. A little bit about myself, if you haven't seen me present yet, my name is Katie. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager with the Quali Build team. And I've been with Quali since our last Quali Days. So it's kind of fun, well, fun and different to see that we're in a different environment now than we were last year. A few housekeeping items before the call. All attendees will be on mute throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, go ahead and click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And feel free to type your questions in there. I will be doing my best to look through those, and then we've got Shannon on the line as well, so we'll either answer them over the Q&A box or live on the webinar. This presentation is being recorded as part of Quali Days, and we will be sending all recordings to attendees following the conference and uploading all the slide decks into our Socio app. So watch for that in the next couple of days as we make those available for you. So like I mentioned, today, we are going to talk about what primarily the fall semester looked like for getting back to campus safely, in whatever version that looked like for your institutions. Now, obviously, we're a few months later, things are changing, but what we really saw back in fall, around the time that everything was changing from the summer, and institutions were saying, okay, what can we do to make things return to as normal as we can? The goal was to, again, return back to campus safely. And what we saw a lot of both our partner institutions create, as well as those just in higher education in general, was some version of digital survey reporting. Many schools launched versions of simple COVID reporting forms. A lot of those had to be launched in weeks or less. In fact, if you attended our session yesterday, or it was either yesterday or Monday, I'm losing track of my days at this point, we talked about how UC San Diego and Davidson had to roll out a solution similar to this in 10 days. That was the objective. Schools, because of such a short time frame, we saw institutions used what they had at their disposal. You used tools that were already existing on your campus, and generally, these forms were used for students, staff, and faculty to report COVID symptoms in some sense. Typically, what we saw is that was then sent to a response team and a team that really managed the COVID response on the campus. A lot of you might on the call might be relating to this because you probably have some version of this on your campus in place today. And when we looked and saw a lot of what these forms look like, just doing a Google search, hundreds of them pop up. They're similar to what I'm showing on the screen right now, where a lot of them were fairly basic. First name, last name, most, if not all, were digital. But the types, if you've been attending some of our sessions through the conference, of things that were missing were some of the more advanced integration type capability that you get with something like a Quali Build. Most of these forms were text entry. There's a lack of workflow capabilities or routing capabilities on the back end. And like I said, if you search on Google, there's hundreds of versions of these forms out there. There's not paper or PDFs, so they are digital, but there's still a level of manual entry required. To the extent where, because of maybe a lack of advanced complexity of the tool, multiple versions of forms have been created. Some for staff, some for students, some for reporting a positive test while others are experiencing symptoms. So managing the complexity of those forms gets pretty unwieldy if you start to think of all the different scenarios that you have on your campus. And like mentioned, we saw a lot of institutions use tools that already were at their disposal. Things like ServiceNow or OnBase or Google Forms. And while these tools are really good for the use case they fill, they lack, in some cases, the flexibility needed to really ultimately solve something like this use case really well. So what that ended up leading to was, on some of these forms that we're seeing on campus, a lack of agility, limited user experience in terms of the requirement for users to input information that already exists on other database systems like the student information system. A lack of automation. So even if the form was filled out, there typically is some manual process required to transfer the data or look at the data and move it into another system and still notify people in that process manually. There's not a lot of reporting typically built in with some of these forms, or it requires a manual export or import of information in order to process data. And there's a lack of really advanced security in some cases, particularly for the more simple forms, which could be a problem considering the type of information around students and around health data that's being submitted as part of these forms. So while schools did indeed go digital, what we found and the opportunity we saw is that there was still a lack of efficiency and agility in some cases with what a situation like COVID really ultimately demands, which brings us to Quali Build. Now, you've all heard about Quali Build, I am sure. Quali Build are Quali's no-code form and workflow solution. Quali Build solves this really interesting place between powerful and complex business systems on your campus. Think your ERP, your ECM, your SIS, where they meet business requirements, but they're expensive to maintain. And in a case where you have to be really agile, they're really difficult to figure out how do you quickly adapt to something like when scenarios literally are changing every week. How do you quickly build something and change it so rapidly in such a complex tool? And on the other side of the coin, you have your simple systems, think like Google Forms, for example. And while these are more agile, they don't ultimately solve some of those more complex needs like integrations and the ability to export data to a business intelligence tool and to do some really complex, powerful reporting that's needed in a scenario like COVID reporting. So there's this sweet spot in the middle that Quali Build sits in, where we're built on core design principles, but we empower business users to do some pretty powerful things. At the same time, IT will actually sign off on the system because we're scalable and we're secure. So with that in mind, I want to talk about, and you might have heard some of these stories this week, but I'm going to share 3 stories of institutions that are using or have used Quali Build to get back to campus in some form safely during the COVID pandemic. The first story I'll share, which Brad actually just spoke a little bit earlier today, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Their objective was to open critical research buildings safely and get researchers back to campus safely. So they launched a build form in order to track what this process looks like so a researcher could apply if they wanted to go ahead and get back to campus, including all the necessary information required to do so. They then, using a data export, brought the data into a business intelligence tool in order to actually analyze and do some more advanced reporting on what data actually looked like on the campus. And without Build, a much less advanced system would have been used to do something very similar. Another example I'll use is Southern Connecticut State University. So again, you may have heard Amy a little bit earlier today. Southern Connecticut State University launched within 2 weeks during the summer when all of the things were changing so quickly. Southern Connecticut launched a series of build forms in order to, again, get researchers back on campus safely. No, the form submissions could be pulled up by campus police on mobile devices to actually validate the individuals on campus had the authority to be on campus when they were there. And one of the challenges that they experienced at that time was, again, requirements were changing so quickly. So when their requirements changed, they were able to quickly apply changes to that form and roll out a new version literally within the same week without any IT support to go ahead and do so. So it allowed them to be a lot more agile in the middle of the COVID experience. And again, without Build, there would have been a much less advanced version to do some of the same, very similar things, something like Excel or a much less advanced, less automated tool to go ahead and do so. And then finally, I'll share the story of Davidson College. So Davidson developed a very robust tracking and analysis system in order to actually do in-person testing and really ultimately get their campus back in person in fall. They developed a really robust ability where different groups of students were tested on a weekly basis And they automated that process, at least the tracking and reporting of it, through using Quality Build. So a student would go and scan their student ID card, which would, in a build form, that would complete a build form. Once they were tested, the symptoms would go ahead and be added onto that build form, or the results of the test would be added onto that build form. And they were able to use build to also make sure to test and see if the people that were supposed to be tested in a particular time actually did get tested at that time. They used a middleware platform called SnapLogic to adapt the data and to do some more advanced reporting on it after it went through the quality build process. And they reported as of this week that they've had over 60,000 submissions since they rolled out this form in the fall time. And ultimately, this process is keeping their testing running smoothly and getting them, keeping them on campus safely since it was originally rolled out in fall. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop my storytelling. I'm actually going to go ahead and switch to another screen. I'm going to show you what this looks like in Quality Build. What we are going to do is we are going to go through a process where I'm going to show you what a really simple version of the form would typically look like in what we're seeing on other campuses. We're then going to go ahead and walk through a really basic overview of how to do some building in Build. Some of you may have already seen this in some of the other sessions this week, so I'll keep it brief, but I just want to give you some sample elements that we'll be pulling when we, at the third step of this demo, go into the advanced form. So I'm going to show you how you could use Build to do something like contract tracing on your campus, and really take not just COVID reporting, but ultimately the automation and the processes around COVID to a next level. So to start out, let's go ahead and just look at a super basic form. This is Build. When I click on an app, I'm taking into where I see a form and a workflow that's part of that application. So I'm going to click on the form part of this process. And you'll see the first thing that you see, let me just move this into the preview mode, is that this is a fairly basic form. I can type information, I can type an ID number, and a lot of form versions that we see are like this. So yes, they're digital, but they're not integrated. So as a student, for example, you know my ID number and you know my first name and you know my last name. So me typing this in is replicating information that already exists on your campus. In addition, one of the other challenges with typing in an open text field is if I make a mistake, I have to resubmit that form. Whereas through using something like an integration, that's automatically pulled in, and you can prevent data errors in the form itself. You'll see I have basic typing fields. The other thing that you'll see, which we see a lot on other digital versions of forms, is that I have some additional fields down here. I say, have I been exposed? Yes or no, and the date of exposure. Well, if I haven't been exposed and if I didn't test positive, there's no reason that these date fields need to show up. So really, an intelligent form tool will allow you to show and hide fields based upon what you actually need to see. There's a variety of other things I could mention here, but I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the workflow side and just show you what we see typical simple workflow routing would generally look like. I might have the ability to notify a few people after I submit something. Here I've got my email notification, and typically in a digital workflow, a less advanced digital workflow system, I can choose a specific person to notify. That might be an email that's added to the form, or that might be the person that submitted the form itself. A more complex routing where I can select people based upon my hierarchy is not as common. So here what you can see is I'm sending just an email to the submitter, and I have some really basic information. But I can't really, in a typical system, customize that much. It's just going to be something like, thank you for your submission. Okay, so we've seen a basic version. So I'm now going to go out of this, and I'm going to hop into a sample app that we used before called Travel Request. This is a really basic app. All it goes through is just building a request for traveling on my campus. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is you can see I've got some really basic fields still. Now let me go ahead. I'm going to build a new section at the bottom. We're going to call this student information. And now on that section, I'm going to go ahead and add the ability to do a more advanced integration. So we're going to go ahead and add a data lookup item. We will call this student name. I'm going to choose my data source and just choose student ID. Oops. There we go. So typically when I set up this integration, what I would be able to do is say, I want to reference this other field on my form. In this case, for the purpose of the demo, I went ahead and fixed that value just to make that really simple. But what you're seeing is I'm actually pulling this integration directly from the student information system. So again, I as a student don't have to manually type this information, it automatically shows up. The other nice thing about using something like a smart data gadget is I can also go ahead and link other fields related to this field. So you can see in this case, for a travel request, I'd probably need the email address, and we'll just throw in the student ID there as well. Okay. Now the other thing I'll call out, but I'm not going to use, is the advisor field. You'll see that I have access to that field through this integration. I'm not going to, in this case, pull it onto my form. Now the next thing is, let's go ahead and add a country dropdown. You can see we've got a ton of dropdowns or a ton of options on that right-hand side. I'm not going to go through all of them, just know we've got a lot of field options if you wanted to use them. Okay, the country dropdown gives me a list of the ability to see all possible countries. You can see I can just select that there, which is great for something like a travel request. And finally, let's go ahead and add a drop-down menu, and we're going to call this purpose. We're going to say maybe a sabbatical, maybe a study abroad. Oops, sure. Now we don't really care about the purpose unless the estimated cost is greater than, we'll say $2,000. So here I'm going to go ahead and click this limit visibility based on other gadgets over to yes. We will select add visibility rule, and we're going to say if estimated cost is greater than 2,000, that this one does include cents as well, so that's why I'm adding a few extra zeros on there. You'll see that now if I was to go over to that, change estimated cost to greater, oh, I added one extra zero, and greater than 20,000. Then I can go ahead and add that purpose. You can also see my country field drops down there as well. And I added that database integration, so the information automatically pulls in. Now let's go back to our editor, and I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the workflow side of things. So if you've been with us through a few sessions this week, you've probably seen some of the elements of our workflow designer. I'm going to show a few specific ones right now. So you can see first that I've got this notify step. Now, one of the things that I'm doing on the notify step is I can add variable fields into my workflow. The variable field pulls information from a form and adds it to the workflow to make it relevant for the person who's receiving the email. In this case, let's go ahead and add a variable field for destination. Let's do that country dropdown field I just added. So now when that country dropdown field is added, when I get that email, it's going to show the relevant information or the place that I am traveling to. So we received your travel request to, and then the country. Let's go ahead and experiment with an acknowledge step. And an acknowledge just says, hey, did you receive this? FYI, this is happening. We're going to go ahead and send this acknowledge step just for fun's sake to the student advisor. Now, if you remember, when I pulled that integration over, one of the things that I mentioned was, hey, look at that advisor field, not using it yet, but remember it's there. Well, one of the really powerful things of using the integration step is even if I'm not having data from that step on my form, I can reference it elsewhere in the app. And that's really important. So you can imagine in this case, I have the advisor. I don't need to add that advisor field on my form because the student probably knows who their advisor is, and it's not really relevant information when I'm submitting it. But it is relevant information when I go to approve something. because I need to know who that person is related to the student. So I can use information associated with an integration on the approval step without having to necessarily reference it. And the other place you can use it is actually when I have a form after I've submitted my information. If I want to sort through things in the document view, which I'll show you just after this, I can actually reference information through an integration and use that to filter past submissions as well. Hold on to that thought. I'll go through that in just a sec. So here I'm adding an acknowledge step to the student advisor. Now you can see we've got some approval steps set on here. One approval step is to the student's manager. The next one is using, I mentioned earlier that it's not very common in other forms tools to be able to route information dynamically. Generally, I have to know who the person is when I'm submitting the form to route an approval to them. So in this case, we're using the powerful ability for us to route to a group, a role of a group, or a group hierarchy. So I'm saying I want to route to the group department and the department chair. And whatever department is completed on that form, that's who this approval is going to route to. Now let's experiment with one more advanced workflow capability, and that's called branching. Branching lets us take a condition that's added onto the form and do something different based upon information that's submitted. So in this case, I just added that step, and the default route is going to go to that department chair. Generally speaking, that's all we really need to know to approve it. But we're going to add another condition here that says if the estimated cost is greater than, I think I got my zeros right there, $2,000, then I'm going to go ahead and route to this other person. Now, one of the nice things about this is rather than me recreating that step, it's not going to work. Okay, so let me go ahead and add an approval step here. We are going to make that go to the department. And rather than the chair, I likely know this isn't a realistic example, but let's just route it to the dean, because the dean really needs to know if expensive things are going to happen. So we'll say this is going to be an approval for the college dean. We'll save that. And okay, I think we should be good. So now we've got a branch condition that routes to the chair, and we have a branch condition in the scenario if something's over an estimated amount that routes to the college dean. The final step I'm going to add here is an integration step. At the final step, we're going to say if this is approved, we want to go ahead and update the student information system. Now, once an integration is set up in your system, you have the ability to go ahead and add a default step that allows you to update information immediately after. So you can see once I save that, what's going to happen is after this entire workflow completes, it's going to go through a final step that pushes an update to our student information system. And in the scenario you were doing a form, something like a change of major request, you could go ahead and update it really easily there. All right. Let me go back out of this. The final thing we're going to go ahead and do now is, now that you've seen a little bit of how to build something and you've seen what a basic form looks like, let's look like what an advanced form to do contract tracing could actually look like. So the first thing you'll see as I go through this process is I've got a different form than I had before. You see I added a lot more fields on it here. I'm going to move this to preview. And you'll see I added that integration that automatically pulls in student information first. Next, you'll see I also added that ability to show or hide fields based upon information submitted. So yes, we're going to say I have been exposed and I tested positive. And as I click those things, new things show up on this form. Now, the other thing that you'll note is that I have a ton of fields on this form below the line that are not being shown when I go to actually submit the form. So we're also using back office sections here to hide unrelevant information for the student that we then need later on in the actual business process itself. Let's now jump over to the workflow process. And what I'm about to show you is going to look very intimidating, but don't worry, we're going to walk through it easily. You'll see, you've probably seen workflow, walked through or demonstrated for a variety of sessions throughout this week, but this is a really good example of how complex you could make a series of review and approval steps in something like workflow in order to handle a much more complex process than is very like one approval next. So it can handle a lot of different conditions you're going through. Now, rather than me walking through this in this view, I'm actually going to use what's called our workflow simulator. The workflow simulator was released in this last year, and it's honestly one of my favorite features in Build, because I've built a lot of forms in workflow in my career, and the hardest part of building a form in workflow is the testing part. I can build a form in probably like a good 20 minutes maybe, and a workflow. The testing part can take much longer. So the workflow simulator lets you run a test to see exactly what's going to happen with your form. And the other nice thing is that when you submit the form, it's only showing you relevant fields in order to actually process that form. So you can see here, I'm going to walk through this process and I'm going to say, yes, I've been exposed. Yes, I've tested positive, and I am self-quarantining. The first thing this process does is it pushes an integration. So our data intelligence system immediately knows what happened. It doesn't have to wait through the entire contract tracing process to happen. Oops. And actually, I'm going to go back. I am going to run one flow that says I've exposed but not tested positive. Let's walk through that one first. So on this first flow, you can see I've got a fair amount of branch conditions set up. Now, I know that I'm testing route 1 of my branch conditions because it's showing me that I'm on route 1 on this parallel route. The other thing I can see is I see the email that would then go that I've set up in my workflow process. So I can notify the student exactly what's happened. And I have also provided dynamic instructions to the student in order to self-quarantine for a period of time after they have been exposed. This can be totally customized, again, using that variable field that I showed you a little earlier. We're going to click next, and now I have an acknowledge step, and the Public Health Committee is just reviewing this submission. You'll notice as they're reviewing it is that all of the fields are not editable. So that's one of the other nice things of using workflow is I can actually lock the edit capability of information after it's been submitted. So people that don't need to edit it don't necessarily have the ability to. We're going to acknowledge that. That's going to finish that route. And now it's going to go to the final integration step. Let's do that process over. And we're going to run a more complex process now. Now we are going to run and pretend like I've been exposed and I've tested positive for COVID. You'll see that integration step again. Now you can see when I look at that parallel route, I'm now on route 2. So route 2 is going to be the contract tracing process. You can see that same notification has gone to the student, but a few additional instructions are being included so they know exactly what they need to do from a contract tracing standpoint. The Public Health Committee will still acknowledge that this indeed has happened. And now a notification is being sent to the contract tracing administrator, who has the ability to review and process this submission. Katie will now begin the review. And what I'm doing here is this particular one ties directly into our curriculum and catalog management system. So Katie, in this case, is reviewing all of the classes that the student has in, I think this is his classroom etiquette right now. You can see as I'm going through this process that some of these are live in person in classroom and some of these are remote. Contract tracing obviously needs to take a different approach if a class is in person or remote. So we are going to go now through this process to adjust the contract tracing depending on the format the class is delivered in. Once that's set up, you'll see we now go to the next part of the process. And I can now see contract tracing. So you'll see because this route is in in classroom, it's actually in person and not remote. It's going through a more advanced process than if the class was remote. The first step is the instructor will be notified exactly of what happened with all the information they need to know in the process. Next, they'll receive an approval, just letting them know again, 1, this is happening, 2, go in and the system is now asking the instructor to complete the next set of fields on the process. So if you remember earlier, all the fields that the instructor doesn't need to complete are now locked, but there's some fields that are unlocked because it actually requires action from the instructor. We're going to go ahead and select some information on those fields. The student did attend the course, they were displaying symptoms, and we know that they had access to some of the following individuals. This would then tie into another system and you could feasibly generate more processes, more contract tracing processes on these individuals once this form had been submitted. And none at this time. Okay. So the instructor is now going to go ahead and approve that. And now you see the next notification is sent to the department chair. They're going to log in, begin the review, and they can now view all the information the instructor submitted, but again, it's all read-only because they are not changing anything. They'll approve that process. And the final step is now sent to Katie to go through the process of reviewing actual actions. You'll see that there's a checklist to just make sure nothing's missed in this process. So she's clicking all the things that have happened, approving it. And again, the really nice thing about this is, particularly for something as sensitive as contract tracing and COVID, all of this is auditable. So at any point in time, you can go back and see exactly who reviewed something, exactly what they said, the date they submitted things, all the steps that had been completed. So it's really, really good from a historical and a safety standpoint related to that. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the routes now that we saw what one classroom experience looked like. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of my workflow tester. And the final thing that I want to show you is something that I didn't walk through before, which is the actual process of publishing the form and submitting information. Oops, let's go back to the form. So let me go ahead and share this form here. We are going to pretend like we're submitting an actual form itself. So you'll see, I'm going to say, yes, I have been exposed. We're going to put the date of exposure back January 6th. And have I tested positive? Let's put that date as, again, January, I'll say 25th. That's a long time from exposure to positivity. Once I submit that, what's going to happen is, if you remember on that process, the first step that we had in the process was an integration step that connected with a business intelligence tool. So what I've done is I've actually connected QualiBuild with Amazon QuickSight, which is a business intelligence reporting tool. Now, QuickSight, you'll see, first of all, this is the reporting dashboard that shows me exactly how many positive infections has been experienced in the course of the last, in this case, January is what's being shown. So I submitted that infection for January 25th. So let me go ahead. The way QuickSight works with most business intelligence tools do is I need to go ahead and refresh the data source. That's going to pull that information through. Typically, business intelligence tools will refresh on something like an hourly basis. So just for the sake of the demo, I'm pushing that a little earlier. And once that's in progress, or once that's complete, we'll go ahead and be able to see that submission on the dashboard. Now, as this is going through the process, please think of some questions if you have any. We're about at the end of the demo and the top of the hour, so feel free to go ahead and join, put those questions in the Q&A box, and I will gladly walk through them. Okay. Let's now go back to this reporting process, and you'll see that one submission we have for January 25th just came in. The other thing that's really helpful about this is, if you remember when I was walking through that process of the advisor on the student advisor, if you remember correctly, I said the other information associated with a database integration is available at other steps in the process. So that includes both in quality build and through an integration as well. In this case, I don't have class year anywhere on that form, but what I've done is, because class year is associated with one of the integrations I used, I'm actually reporting in my business intelligence tool on what percentage of people in each class were actually infected with COVID. So you can imagine, if you start thinking of the integration capabilities you have on your campus, how much more analysis and learning you could get by just going through that process of pulling information in and using a more advanced tool to do some really cool reporting and analytics. All right, well, please go ahead. Let me go ahead and actually go back to the final step of my presentation. So we'll take questions right now. I know that we're almost at the top of the hour, so I'll just go through my final slides and go back to questions. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at build@koali.co.